welcome everyone. Thanks to the organizers of this event and congratulations for the success of the event. This is great. I am, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Carl Guido. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a professor both in French and comparative literature, and I'm also currently serving as an associate dean of the Division of Arts and Humanities here at Berkeley. And I'm really delighted to introduce Professor Poulomi Saha, she, they. She's an associate professor of English and incoming director of the program in critical theory here at Berkeley. Their research and teaching interests span post-colonial studies, ethnic American literature, feminist and queer theory, critical theory, and psychoanalytic critique. Her first book, An Empire of Touch, Women's Political Labor and the Fabrication of East Bengal, published by Columbia University Press in 2019, was awarded the 2020 Harry Levin Prize for Outstanding First Book by the ACLA, the American Comparative Literature Association, and also the Helen Carter First Book Award. Saha's scholarship has appeared in Differences, Kitab, Signs, Interventions, the Journal of Modern Literature, Postcolonial Literary Inquiry, and the Journal of American Studies, among other places. And they are currently at work on a book project entitled Fascination, America's Indian Cults. That is the formal introduction. I will also just add that I'm feeling a little bit jealous of those of you who are here who have had the opportunity to be Professor Saha's student, because she is exactly the kind of brilliant thinker and witty stylist and consummate performer that would have made of her the kind of professor of whom I would have been an enormous fan, if not to say an out and out groupie. But if I haven't had the pleasure of being her student yet, I have had the pleasure of hearing them speak on numerous occasions, present their work, and I can say with absolute confidence that we are in for a real intellectual treat. Her talk today is called Chasing Bliss and Chasing Race. So please join me in welcoming Professor Saha.
Thank you. I mean, that was an unduly kind introduction. I'm so delighted to be here. This is really an honor and such fun. I know some of you from class, and I will say that for those of you taking class with me, this will be a slightly different genre than you usually get, in that my classes are a little more ad hoc. We will start with notes and things go, as you know, where they will go. But today I'm actually going to read a talk, but hopefully it will be interesting enough that you won't get too mesmerized by my voice and fall asleep. But what I thought I would do today is actually try out some new material. I'm writing this book called Fascination, and it is a book that's interested in why it is that America has had this long kind of enthrallment with the idea of Indian spirituality. And my argument right now is that what we think of as Indian spirituality in America is actually an American experiment. That when we think about these formations, they're actually made in America, produced for an American audience, and designed to test the limits of American society. That actually we have to produce the kind of foreign other to play out particular desires, particular hungers, particular transgressions. And it is these transgressions and hungers that often then take on the name cult. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is from, I don't know, let's call it the penultimate chapter of this book. And it comes about through an accident. And I'm going to try and narrate a little bit the accident. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end. We can sort of chat generally about what works and what doesn't work. The nice thing about sharing kind of early work is I am very open to you telling me that the argument just doesn't hold. So let's get started. How many swipes does it take? how many Instagram posts between the carefully stylized image of an East Bay yoga instructor in flying pigeon pose with the Golden Gate Bridge in the background and oh, hold on. Can I get sound? Sorry. This is now, for those of you who are in class with me, you know that this is my classic situation. Make sure that the sound. Yes. No. There. Okay, so I'll remind you of the premise that this is the first, and then this. A group of young people dressed in saris and ochre robes mic'd up as they danced down a New York street, chanting. Thanks to the algorithm, there are very few swipes between these posts. It might surprise you, this curated path between a now ubiquitous feature of suburban life, yoga, and one of the most familiar examples of the American cult, the Hare Krishnas, or as they are also known, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. From the vantage of the algorithm, though, which mines what you already say you're interested in to offer you new content that's both familiar and surprising, the relationship between yoga and the Hare Krishnas is actually obvious. Both are deeply American practices that claim ancient Indian origins. Both claim as their goal the cultivation of the mind and the body towards a higher plane. Both attract fervent devotion. And yet, we don't usually talk about them in the same way. The International Society for Krishna Consciousness was, especially in the 70s and 80s, the exemplar of the cult. They faced charges of brainwashing, kidnapping, murder, and they fought for the right to distribute pamphlets and solicit donations in public spaces, a legal battle that took them all the way to the Supreme Court. The Hare Krishnas are a decidedly non-mainstream phenomenon. Their public appearance has been largely that of disruption, an insistence of foreignness. They wear the signs of their devotion proudly on their bodies, and they demonstrate it openly. They sing and dance and chant on the streets. So maybe this is why the 5 swipes between the East Bay yogi and the urban worship caught me by surprise. Decades after their hypervisibility in airports, on street corners, passing out daffodils and clambering away on symbols as they chant Hare Krishna, decades after the hand-wringing about stolen youth and kidnapping and slavish attachment, here in our cynical age of overexposure, the return of the Hare Krishna, of her public ecstasies and her atonal singing. All over Instagram, there are these videos by and of contemporary followers of ISKCON, largely young, in their 20s and early 30s, almost uniformly white and English speaking. The stars of these minute-long reels are throwback to an earlier time, a time of counterculture and the backlash against its excesses, but now in an entirely new guise. So the Hare Krishna on the street corner that used to make us so anxious is now the Hare Krishna in your pocket, still chanting her public devotions and leading algorithmically to highly stylized videos of what I will call a multiracial fantasy of Krishna consciousness. And for the Euro-American yoga devotee, offering a new avenue to authentic Indianness. So in what follows, I'm going to trace an arc of the International Society of Krishna Consciousness to parse a particular American spiritual hunger, the desire to be fully immersed in the experience of ecstasy, to lose oneself in devotion, and in turn, to be found as part of a kind of limitless union. These longings can only be met from outside the bounds of a society committed to the fantasy of the autonomous subject. But the Hare Krishna movement, I will remind you, is not a foreign phenomenon. It's an American invention, a radical other designed to meet and elicit desires impossible to reconcile with the project of American individualism. So their public performance and their cultural reception disrupt this social compact in which we perform our own containment. And it's true that the varied scandals of the Hare Krishnas, these allegations of kidnapping, of brainwashing, of sexual abuse, of murder, financial impropriety, would seem to warrant the term cult. But I want to suggest that cult is a kind of sheath of meaning, that we are give to forms of public and shared enchantment that are only tangentially related to the abuses of power and violence that follow. So coded literally in the appeal and the anxiety is this fantasy of transformation, that it is possible by joining the Hare Krishnas to become something radically different than you were, than the world you came from. You can become enlightened, you can become blissful, you can become Indian. So part one, sweeter than acid, cheaper than pot. A 70-year-old renunciate was one of the first Indians to arrive in the United States under the auspices of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. The lore of his coming holds that A.C. Bhagavavedanta Swami Prabhupada, I will call him Prabhupada from here on out, when he arrived in September 19th, 1965, this was the manifestation of a divine instruction. 50 years earlier, he had been commanded to translate the gospel of the Hindu god Krishna for the West. Having abandoned his wife and children when he was in his 50s, he then joins the wandering mendicants of the city of Vrindavan, which is said to be where Krishna spent his childhood, and where it's believed that if you die, you will instantly reach salvation. There, he struggled to find followers because he was one of countless holy men preaching the word of Krishna. So what will come to captivate thousands of minds in America and Europe as a revolutionary spiritual vision was totally mundane in Vrindavan. So against all odds, age, illness, a lack of financial support, Prabhupada arrives in New York with a classic American story. Only $7 in his pocket and a trunk filled with 20,000 copies of the Bhagavad Gita. The fortune he came to seek was not of money, but of spiritual liberation. And he, like many an immigrant before him, saw America as the land where dreams of prosperity come true. The success denied him in Vrindavan could be compensated hugely in a new land, not yet saturated by the knowledge of Krishna, and where his racial and philosophical difference cohered into a powerful, charismatic authority. It, of course, helps that he looks the part of the wizened sage, draped in ochre robes, bald, and always wearing on his face the elongated U on his forehead that is the tilak, or the mark of Krishna. So in 1965, there were approximately 13,000 people of Indian descent living in the United States. The Immigration and Nationality Act of that year abolished previously held national quotas, where there were a very, very small number of people allowed into this country from other nations. It abolished those quotas, it incentivized visas for students and skilled workers, and implemented a policy of family reunification. This has been the single most deciding policy in shaping the racial constitution of America. What this room looks like right now is a direct result of this law. So Prabhupada's canny visa petition as a religious teacher instrumentalized both the need for educated immigrants and the relative rarity of his application. And it seems to have worked. What started as a small storefront in the East Village, ISKCON actually attracted thousands of followers within the first few years. Today, the movement claims 1 million followers and 800 centers across the world, beginning with twice a week classes on the Bhagavad Gita, daily chantings, and free meals of vegetarian food that he cooked himself. Prabhupada opens the doors to everyone with a single remarkable product on offer: unending, all-encompassing bliss. The East Village Other wrote of him back then that it managed to promote, quote, a brand of consciousness expansion that's sweeter than acid, cheaper than pot, and non-bustable by the fuzz. You guys know what the fuzz is? All right. So, part two, stay high forever. Many of his early followers were children of the New Age. This is 1965. Between the ages of 18 and 40, white, college educated. Some were already acquainted with Indian philosophy from places like Berkeley. Others were just eager to break through the insulation of disenchantment. Understanding, maybe after years of failing to gather followers, that the philosophical complexity of the Bhagavad Gita and the teachings of the 15th century mystic Sri Chaitanya were not easily consumable, Prabhupada produces an architecture of a new path to Krishna consciousness through one thing only, bhakti, or worshipful devotion. And it comes down to a practice oriented to one image and one ritual practice, the enjoyment just to chant. This is where my technology is going to get better at me. This is, can you read this? It's pretty small. So this is actually the cover of the first album released by ISKCON. The album is 3 tracks. This song goes on for 23 minutes. There's another chant that goes on for 13 minutes, and then 5 minutes of Prabhupada speaking. But if you look at the copy, it tells us something pretty remarkable about what is on offer. Enlightenment, the realization of our indissoluble unity with the cosmic divine, isn't just accessible. It's already hard-coded in us. At each step, there is an instruction of the body, whose comportment and senses give you the next step. Alighted entirely and purposefully is something like the conscious mind, because it says that the mirror that it reflects is not the image of itself. That is, the mind is itself an illusion. This is the inverse of Alice and the Looking Glass, where it is in fact the mirror that is a surreal distortion. We take the illusion of ourself as the reality. So how do we do this? You begin with the body. Sit, relax. The sound vibration of the mantra will engage 2 senses in turn. First hearing, and then speech. You can't stay a mere listener of the mantra. It transforms a listener into a singer, who will then in turn engage the body in dance. Arms overhead. Arms overhead as Sri Chaitanya appears in these historical images of himself on the left. And here on the right, contemporary followers of Hare Krishna. In the center there is George Harrison. The dance is a repetition of the form of the original teacher, moving towards proximity by similarity. The mantra will make of the body of the devotee something whose actions speak to the power of the sound of the word. The first album, which would sell out almost immediately, is how ISKCON comes to the attention of George Harrison and John Lennon of the Beatles. Harrison later writes that he and Lennon were totally taken by the album. Quote, "I remember we sang it for days, like 6 hours we sang, because we couldn't stop once we got going. As soon as we stopped, it was like the lights went out. It went on to the point where our jaws were aching, singing the mantra over and over and over and over and over and over. We felt exalted. It was a very happy time for us." End quote. So here is that loving devotion in action, an automaticity that defies the body and its pain, because what's the ache of your jaw when the sound determines light and dark? Exaltation and nothingness. The conscious mind, which might otherwise step in to say, this does not feel good, falls away in the presence of that transcendental sound. This is the power of the word. So in 1966, having gathered a few dozen regular followers, including Allen Ginsberg, who had just returned from India, Prabhupada pushes his disciples out of the storefront into Tompkins Square Park. And I'm actually going to play this, which is them chanting, but I'm going to play it without sound. This first collective chanting session, which is captured on video, demonstrates a remarkable phenomenon, an amplification of the sound effect from the album. As the Hare Krishnas chant, a crowd gathers, first watching stiffly. The suspicion armors the body. But as the polyphonic sound wears away at that carapace, permeates a resistant body, it begins to sway. And then to chant, first silently and then aloud. You see people actually transformed over the course of this video. People's bodies do things they did not expect them to do. When we describe it like this, Krishna consciousness is like a contagion, infecting the body with an unwelcome presence, where that consciousness, Krishna consciousness, strips away self-consciousness. This is one of the canonical dangers of what we think of as cults, that we might be enthralled against our will. This idea depends on the concept of the unwilling listener, the dubious skeptic. But if this was the case, that most people do not want to be drawn into this kind of collective feeling, what's the danger of the Hare Krishnas? What is the threat of their performed public devotions if a public is truly impervious? The answer is none. I want to suggest that the fear and the anxiety evoked by the Hare Krishnas, the idea of a public visible devotion, elicits actually a kind of longing. For what? It's the desire, I think, to become porous to and with others, to share in a communal feeling and to be transformed by it. So when Sigmund Freud writes in The Civilization and Its Discontents of a peculiar feeling that he can't discover himself, but he understands is experienced by millions of people, he writes, quote, a sensation of eternity, a feeling as of something limitless, unbounded, as it were oceanic. He's describing here a feeling of limitlessness through a shared experience with another, religion. In the performance of the collective chant, what's elicited is a shared experience of limitlessness that is not itself limitless. That is, the chant will end. You have to go home from the park. The state of heightened sensation, that will recede. You're going to return from the shared state of ecstasy, this state of permeability, but you will be changed. You will have been made porous. You will become a part of a collective experience that depends on a corporate that is shared, but not identical feeling. And the trace of that experience may not actually appear on your body, but it will leave a mark. So part 3, the body tells. For devout Hare Krishnas, that mark is made visible. The sign of devotion on the body is one of the densest cultural reference of the movement. Performances of collective ecstasy on street corners, in parks, in airports is hued, quite literally, by an intensity of faith manufacturing a devout body. So men, in citation of traditional Hindu holy men and Sri Chaitanya, wear unstitched cloth in ochre color. You can't quite tell what the ochre is, but it's the same color as the background there. They might even shave their heads completely except for a long tuft of hair at the back of the skull. Women wear saris and both adorn their foreheads with the emblem of the Vaishnav faith, the same thing that Prabhupada wears on his forehead. They also adopt new names, insistently Sanskrit ones. To be perfectly clear, there's no requirement of these transformations. Prabhupada says all you have to do is chant. But it became a practice to evince a kind of bodily conversion. This isn't uncommon as religious practices goes, except for a few features that it's worth us thinking about. Hinduism, which is a very complicated belief system that gets stabilized as a thing called religion, but generally, Hinduism doesn't require conversion. There's no ritual or procedure to become a Hindu, though the performance of religion is fundamentally structured through caste. Does everyone know what caste is? Yes? In case you don't and you have failed to raise your hand, I'm going to tell you anyway, which is that caste is a hierarchical social structure that conditions everything about life on the subcontinent, even today. People are divided into distinct groups based on, technically, their birth, occupation, and status, but these are groups that don't happen in your birth. Your caste is a thing that identifies you through genealogy that's generations old beyond counting. That's the point. You're not supposed to be able to change it. It is an unchangeable mark. And the system is deeply structured by questions of, and fantasies of purity and pollution, where individuals who are given a specific caste, which determines their social status, their economic status, their political standing, have to actually maintain order through differentiation from other bodies. The question of purity becomes really important. So Brahmins, the highest caste, were traditionally priests. And on the other side of the hierarchy are Dalits, people who are formerly called untouchables in the caste system, and whose body was literally untouchable. I mean, you think about this as like a word, but imagine if it was impossible for you to think about brushing shoulders with the person who walked next to you. There are forms of this belief that say that the shadow of a Dalit cannot fall on an upper caste person. The shadow. We are talking about interdictions, not just of like real proximity, but just the idea that you would even share vague space. This is what structures psychic and social life on the subcontinent. Now, in America, Prabhupada offers a radical innovation, insisting that Brahmin is a performative category rather than a genealogical one, something you can do rather than something you inherit. He makes faith transformative. Felt and performed belief in any raced, gendered body is worthy of inclusion into a category normally reserved for those who by birth and endogamy had an exclusive claim to speaking holy words. More than that, through their daily devotions of chanting, the Hare Krishnas are now closer to the divine than even the rarefied caste. Prabhupada is like, people who just are born into it aren't truly close to divine. It is this action that renders you truly near holiness. So Krishna consciousness isn't a religion that's from a place or endemic to a people, but it's a practice of becoming, a purification of the self into a new being and a new collective or community. So to enact the procedures of faith is to join a long lineage of people that Prabhupada claims goes all the way back to Krishna. It is to become intimate, related to, descended from the Godhead itself. And also to effect a kind of racial transformation. One doesn't necessarily become Indian, but certainly they cease to be what they were before. Remember, largely white, educated, middle-class Americans. So maybe then it's not that surprising, despite my expectations, that ISKCON thrives today, right here in the Bay. When Prabhupada came to America, the non-Indian, non-Hindu population proved itself open to the transformation of a self towards new consciousness. But now it seems clear that ISKCON's ideology of a kind of racial devotion has a new ready audience. It's cheap, I know. Namaste, bitches. An estimated 40 million Americans practice yoga, and its industry of studios, clothing, equipment is valued at $110 billion. Fully mainstream, practiced openly by everyone from celebrities to politicians to your mom. Central to its marketability as a health and lifestyle is that while its roots lie in broad Vedic philosophy, it can be practiced and consumed entirely outside of that tradition. In the 21st century, yoga transformed practices that just as recently as the 70s and 80s had become recognizable signs of the cult on the one hand, and were patrolled by ancient interdictions of caste and gender on the other. Sanskrit mantras, which are liberally translated into idioms of well-being and self-care in the studio, have been cauterized from their Vedic roots, which would have barred them from being uttered by non-Brahmins. The holy words that are prescribed in these texts, like the Manu Smriti, only to be uttered by Brahmin men who've been instructed to do so. And if a woman or a lower caste person is to even hear these words, does anyone know what is to happen to them in the Manu Smriti? What happens if a woman or a lower caste person even hears the holy words? It is prescribed that they should have hot lead poured in their ears. This is how violently patrolled questions of caste and access to Sanskrit are. And we're not just talking again about millennia. We are talking about very recent and actually still contemporary history. So it's really easy to forget in the soft lighting and the Palo Santo of your yoga studio that these words that get offered up as, reflections during your practice are actually the site of extraordinary social violence. At the same time, because they're so freely consumable, these rituals offer a tantalizing fantasy that you can be intimate to and have knowledge of, a timeless practice that saints and ascetics have done for years. Not just, timeless, but how often in the yoga class does someone murmur, Gandhi practiced yoga. To share in this practice, to make your body do this thing as other people have done, is then somehow to align yourself to them. So practicing this form of yoga, repeating these holy words, can initiate the hungry American yogi into a spiritual lineage, shorn of all the bad, hard stuff. Both yoga and Prabhupada say, don't read the Manu Smriti. All you have to do are these things, either chant or bend, right? So this suggests that yoga is a kind of spirituality in and of itself, right? This is the common understanding in America of yoga. And that, in turn, if yoga is spirituality, that spirituality, like yoga, can be consumed and acquired. You can become more spiritual by buying the right thing, by engaging in the right social practices. So it's not then that surprising that for some people, yoga is the kind of royal road back to India where it was born. That people have this fantasy to practice yoga is to align yourself to its roots, and that the bodily and psychic transformations might be accompanied by a racial transformation. This is a desire for, I would say, a transcendental Indianness, not to change the color of your skin or your racial origins, but to have a kind of inalienable claim to what India is imagined to represent. The spiritual wellspring, the elemental source. But in order to effect this transformation, the American yogi has to make claims to a non-genealogical conception of identity, which is hard because here in the Bay, there are nearly 400,000 people of Indian descent, just in the Bay Area. 27% of tech workers are Indian born. More than half of them have arrived in the last 15 years. 2.5% of the population of San Jose identifies as Hindu. And in the Bay Area, there are more than 70 temples, and they cater to a myriad of deities, linguistic communities, and philosophical traditions. So 60 years after the passage of the Immigration and Naturalization Act, the terrain of religious and spiritual organizations morphs towards a growing diasporic population. So when Swami Prabhupada arrives in 1965, he looks to a white American audience. Now, For a white American audience who wants this form of spirituality, they cannot turn to the enormous geography of temples. Why? Because to go into a temple, to want to experience faith in this way, would require you to know all kinds of things: language, customs, rituals, clothing. There are a lot of barriers to access here. So if you are primed to desire India and closeness to Indian spirituality as a kind of commodity, how do you immerse yourself? If you are turned away from these diasporic religious communities, you have the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, still offering you that ecstatic union with the divine and the idea of Indianness. And while the doctrine of Krishna consciousness will claim to do away with caste hierarchy so that everyone is included, it in practice actually enacts a kind of alchemical transformation of whiteness into upper casteness, right? It's not just that everyone can be Brahmin, but it is that whiteness can become upper caste. What does it mean to be upper caste? It means to have unfettered access to the knowledge and authority of the Vedas. So then it's really not surprising that within the data-dense, predictive patterning of social media, ISKCON and yoga sit side by side. The algorithm knows and it tells, based on intentional and accidental encounters, clicks with posts that are coded with content. Automatic posts on Instagram's Explore page work to direct your desire. So one day of viewing a Berkeley yogi profile produced for me within hours videos of Hare Krishnas throughout my scrolling Explore page. It has now destroyed my Instagram. They come in two notable genres. The first is the one that I showed you at the beginning of these public chants and collective chants shot on urban streets. There's little editing. It's only the diegetic sound of the chant. These videos invite the common question. People are still joining the Hare Krishnas? Why? If we have inherited 40 years now a story that the Hare Krishnas are a cult, how come people are still joining? What draws people in? Now, the second genre might tell us something about why there are hundreds of these highly stylized reels of an erotically charged racial and spiritual fantasy with soundtrack clips of popular Bollywood songs and shot in Vrindavan. They feature a white woman clad in a sari bearing all the markers of traditional Hindu femininity. And securing her place in that embodiment and in India itself is the figure of the hyper-masculine Indian man who is both the object of desire and of worship. He signals a muscular, literally muscular, religiosity, which in this contemporary moment in India is deeply tied to the Hindu rite and to the idea of India as a Hindu nation. So in a globalized world where diasporic Indians are essential to the writing of the algorithm by which yoga stands cheek to jowl with the Hare Krishna influencer movement, it seems imperative that we ask how the algorithm works, not as a technical phenomenon, because as you know, I know nothing about technology, but as a cultural and political one. That is, what is a relationship of manifest and latent desire that is encoded? I don't have an answer, but I do have another complication, which is that currently before the California Supreme Court, there's a class action caste discrimination suit brought about by Dalit tech workers against Cisco Systems. They allege that Brahmin supervisors in America enact systematic exclusions and discriminations against openly Dalit workers, coded in those who write the algorithm is a complex and millennia-old battle over who has access not just to holy words that might bring about spiritual liberation, but to extraordinary social, economic, and political power. The radical promise of Krishna consciousness imported to America as part of an early immigration of educated Indians is the sacred key that's available to everyone. Anyone can put these words in their mouth. And yet at the same time, the project of Krishna consciousness today is inextricable from the economics of commodified spirituality in the form of yoga and the politics of the Hindu right. We cannot then ignore the trace of caste violence in the center of this tight knot. It's the ghost in the machine. I've traced here a genealogy of spiritual longing to argue that America produces a form of religiosity that, precisely in marking itself as foreign, redoubles the American self. The logic of contemporary yoga does the same. It remakes the American body and mind through a yoga that is Indian. And in so doing, the American self doubles its claims to whiteness and indeed to a kind of uber-Americanness while participating in a necessary vanishing of racial difference.